when we use that metaphor of an anchor off the bottom, or that sort of turbulence, I'm often thinking, what are some things that can anchor us? And I want to just share a couple of things that we've found really helpful and experienced in working with schools as well, that really can hold that ground for us. So I'll just share the screen with you. This screen here, this image. How many people have seen the social discipline window or used it with their schools or their kura before? Just a quick sort of wave of hands. People have seen it, haven't seen it. Essentially, as a construct, you'll see it's made up of a vertical axis here and a horizontal. And appreciate lots of you are familiar with this, but this here, low to high, all about the structures, limits, and expectations, and along the bottom, low to high, all about support, care, and concern. And when we think about these 4 quadrants, lots of structure without any support can feel quite punitive, or when things are done to you, it's confrontational, win-lose, authoritarian, stigmatizing. Bottom right, when it's all about the care and concern, but has very little structure or expectation around it, can feel quite permissive, can feel a bit fluffy or protective. And when things are done for you, when both those things are low, things are not done at all, or it's quite neglectful and inherently unsafe. But when we have those things in balance, there's high expectations, high structure, but lots of support, lots of wraparounds and care. It's often, when we work with, we often use the term restorative in there, but that problem-solving, respectful, collaborative domain. And there's, lots of you will be familiar with Russell Bishop's Teaching to the Northeast. It reflects on some of these structures as well. And often we're wrestling with that. How do we find that place where we're firm and fair? We're constantly doing that dance. We're constantly in that sort of wrestle between, and I've heard it often talked about as being, how do you be a warm demander? That's some other language around there. A term we have heard too, which I think is really helpful. How do you be gently relentless? And so this is other language around this, but where we've found this a very helpful and anchoring structure, if you like, is both being able to locate ourselves within it and where we operate, but also to be able to acknowledge some of the places we sometimes default to. And it's a lens to look through, and a very helpful one at times. But I wonder, as we sort of reflect on some of the language in here, none of us are any of these places all the time. But when we think about some of the different places that we can operate in, I know that, there's times of day and when turbulence is arising, and when I'm in the midst of a really challenging conversation with someone, as I was the other day, when someone's laying it on, heavy and hard, I find myself sort of defaulting over here, almost into this 2 quadrant, where it becomes quite abrasive, and you can feel that confrontation sort of rising in you. Or when it just really feels like, they just need so much of a leg up in here and so much help, I'm just going to do it for them because it's the only way it's going to get done. And I end up defaulting down into this permissive kind of space. Or when too many tabs are open in our life, not just on our desktop, in our very existence, I can find myself at times shutting down, almost dropping into this neglectful box. And aspirationally, it's a really helpful construct to think, how do I get myself into that with space where I have got those high expectations, I am being consistent, I have got structure, but I'm supportive and concerned and caring along the way. And often working with becomes the kind of the ideal, where the best outcomes come from. But a question we pose here, and something to just reflect on for a moment, is when you are, or your staff are, physically and emotionally spent, and many of us have been in those places recently, where do you default to? What's the place that you default to? And I suppose it's helpful in a sense to recognize both, where do I operate when things are going fantastically well, but also where do I go when things aren't so great? And where this framework becomes a helpful reflection piece is where we can both acknowledge that's where I go, and that's where I go, and that's where I go, and to have those very, very healthy conversations with one another, almost giving staff a permission to actually let's talk about where we go, where we default to, where we go when the going gets tough, when we are spent, and how do we get ourselves ultimately facing back towards that with quadrant where the the ideal outcomes often come from. So it can be quite an anchoring document, an anchoring framework to look at. But I really love one interpretation of this, which I just wanted to share with you. And this was a staff member who said, I think, we all acknowledge we can be all those things. I can be all those things before 8:30 in the morning on some days, to be honest. And I did hear someone recently suggest when they reflected on it, oh, that with box, that's what you're in term 1. And then this is what you're in term 2, this is what you're in term 3, and this is what you're in term 4. So, there's a reality about the different places we can find ourselves. But I love this reflection on this, which was a staff member who said, I can't be all those things all the time. I know where the good stuff comes from. It comes from being in that with quadrant. But I think one of the key questions to ask of ourselves is, where do people experience you as their home base? And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, it's like if I'm in this with quadrant, most of the time, this is my home base experience that people have of me. It's almost like having a big, thick rubber band, because some days that will stretch over here. Some days it's got a bit more of a harder edge to my responses, but they know that the spring back will be back over here. I'll spring back to that with place. And some days people need much more of a supportive leg up, but the spring back is to work with. And some days I'm just tactical, I just can't go there. There's too much else happening, but that's not my mode of operating all the time. My home base experience is in that with quadrant. And I think there's a good dose of reality in that. But the question she posed is, if you asked students, where would they say you were as their home base experience? And she said, if it's in that with quadrant, then that's a healthy place, and there's a tolerance to experience you in some of those other places. I think that's quite helpful. I found it very helpful anyway. But she said the scary thing is, if you asked a student, where do you experience miss or sir or fire? Where do you experience this particular staff member as their home base? And they looked at you and said, I don't know. Or it could be anything on any given day. That's kind of quite deeply concerning in a sense. And so the question then sort of leads on from that. Where do your staff or your colleagues potentially experience you as their home base experience on that social discipline window? So just hold that thought, because we'll come back to that in a few moments. So that's one little anchoring construct I wanted to share with you as a little lens. It's really helpful to reflect, where are we operating, where are we defaulting to, but also what quadrant do we need to be in to be reflecting our school's values. And probably almost universally would acknowledge we have to be operating here to be reflecting the values of the very establishments that we're working in. So just wanted to share that with you. And then there's one other little anchoring set of guides here, which I find really, really helpful as well. And this comes out of some of the work of Howard Zehr. Some of you will have heard of Howard Zehr. He's often considered by many to be one of the grandfathers of the modern restorative movement anyway, the writing around restorative. And he presented these 10 ways to live restoratively. And I suppose in these turbulent times that we're in, when the anchor is off the bottom frequently, if we've needed some guidelines for how to be and communicate with one another, it's kind of now. And so these 10 ways to live restoratively present some quite extraordinary kind of help, well, I believe, in this area to just help us navigate this really tricky stuff with one another. And so we'll send this out to you as we mentioned earlier, but as you read down some of those ways of being, some of those ways that he calls living restoratively, I wonder what really resonates for you, or what you see in there and think, actually, that's actually really helpful in here. Things like, when we come down to those things, particularly down the bottom, number 9, be cautious about imposing your truths and views on other people. Number 7, listen deeply and compassionately to others, seeking to understand, even if you don't agree with them. If ever we've needed some guidelines about how to sort of walk that uneasy space of sort of agreeing to disagree, it's now, isn't it? Sensitively confront everyday injustices.
One way Rich showed you the social discipline window, and this is an adaptation that we did this a number of years ago, and I'm just going to briefly speak to this for a moment. But I suppose the reason I bring this in is it's my go-to and things. I was working with some colleagues in the last couple of days, and I felt myself just falling into this. Oh, I can solve your problem for you. And in fact, if I solve it for you, it'll be solved so much quicker. And I can I tell you what you should do. You should go and do this, this, and this. And I caught myself before I started talking, and I thought, hold on. Is it my problem to solve? Is it me to tell him to do it, what to do? Or is it for me to go, what do you need out of this? What are some possible solutions you could have? And at that time, I caught myself, what I recognized I was up in this tell box. I wasn't being punitive, and I wasn't being horrible, and I wasn't trying to drive over the top of someone. But in my eagerness to help, and my eagerness of busyness, and probably the fact that wasn't as level as I can be at times, I just fell into that tell box in those spaces. And on the flip side, I was with another school recently, and I was working with the principal and leadership team, and they've had a couple of just about PGs come through from staff, and infighting between the Rumakireo unit and the mainstream unit, and it's just getting really nasty. And I almost felt myself jumping into the answers and going, I can see what's happening. You've done this, and you're going there, and you're good, and I could almost sum it up. And I caught myself to go, just because I can see it doesn't mean I need to say it. And just because I can see it doesn't mean I need to give them the answers. The bigger challenge is, how do I create space to help them experience that for themselves, and to understand the opportunity for them to be able to speak and share what they need to be sharing in spaces, and just to be, I suppose, real enough to go, I don't have to solve everything. I actually don't have to be the solver of all the problems, and give myself permission in those spaces. And I remember one comment, I was working with a principal, and this was just literally at the end of last term, and the leadership team was sort of bumping along. That was sort of out of sorts. There was frustrations, things weren't getting done when they were supposed to be done, and so the DP was picking it up and doing it on the behalf of the principal, and he wasn't getting it done when she, and you could just see this thing festering away. And then one staff member had let it go about the cups in the sink in the staff room, and it just got, and that had triggered someone in their own anxiety and some domestic violence they'd been part of in the previous, and so she didn't want to come to school, and all of a sudden you just saw this blow up. And my colleague and I came in, and we just did some connecting with them, and asked them what their concerns were, and what was going on, and what they needed out of this, and what do you need the particular people to hear. And it was really, really interesting, because once you got past the bluster, once you got past the rant, once it got back to it, I said, what do you really need them to hear? I just want them to know this. Okay. And what avenue would work for you to do that, and it started with, well, I've got to be in the room, and I've got to tell them straight what's happening, and it ended in the conversation going, actually, I don't need to tell them, because I've had my chance to have the say now, and what I do need is, I'd love you to tell them on my behalf. I'd love that, because I don't need to face them right now. I actually got no bandwidth to be able to do that, and I love that idea of, it was something so simple of just stopping, providing space, and just coming back with questions, and not trying to be smart with questioning, but actually being genuine, authentic, and curious, and asking well-crafted questions, and then going, how do we follow through on that? And I remember I had the principal and the DP and one of the staff members that was really quite heated and really broken. And when we were talking to her first up, there was that real grief cry that came out of her, and so it was a real heartfelt stuff that was going on. And what I noticed, even as we jumped into that hui, into that meeting, the principals jumped straight into the answering mode. fix up mode, to help her out. And you could see her pain, and he just wanted to go in and fix it. And I had to stop him and go, Toiho, just hold for a minute. We're not at the fixing stage yet. Just be and let her share. And then in a moment, you can choose what you want to say in a moment. And it was sort of been quite staunch, but with a real heart in that space. And actually, I remember actually have to a couple of times being able to say to the principal, just hold, you can have your say in a moment. Can you just stop for a moment, just to listen, And to his credit, he did. And he was amazing. And he could actually just stop, and he recognized in himself that he was falling into his own default. And he went, later on, I gave him a chance to have his say. He says, I'm sorry, I jumped in, and I've probably been trying to solve problems in the past, and that hasn't helped anybody. And I've been trying to do what I thought was right, but actually realized what I should have done is come and ask for you and found out what you need. And so love that simplicity, but the complexity within that simplicity in that space there as well. So 2 wee ideas I want to share with you. And the first one is from Stephen Covey, and you probably will all have read the 7 habits of highly effective people. I think it's what it's supposed to say. But I love this idea here is that I think so often, he talks about these circles, it's not the Simon Sinek circle, it's the Covey circles around what we can control, what's within our grasp, what we can influence, what we can shift and change. And depending on where we situated, what roles we have bigger or lesser influence, and what we're concerned about, what gives us real concern. And right now, if I asked you to talk about what you're concerned about, I guarantee you could rattle off all sorts of things. The challenge is when we sit in that area of concern, what Covey says, he says there are places that we actually can't do anything about. And actually that was a place that then often breeds fear, and that fear will very often lead to out of control, which will lead to anxiety, and those triggers within those spaces. And I think so often, and I've got lots of things I'm concerned about. And one of the thinkings he's done in that space, he said, when you're concerned, it's good to be concerned, but don't ruminate on it. Don't spend all your time talking about it. Park it, acknowledge it, and park it, and then go back to what can we control that's right within my own modus of control, and what can I influence, and how do I stretch that circle of influence and by the way I choose to respond to things that come my way. And I love that idea of how do I acknowledge the things concerning, but park them, and then focus on what I can control and focus on what I can influence. And I was with a group of pastoral deans in their leadership meeting, in their pastoral meeting just last week, actually, and they were talking about kids come back to school, and we've lost so many kids and we can't do this and they're not engaging. And what we ended up doing is they spend a whole lot of time around all these things they're concerned about, but they have no control and no influence over. And my challenge to them is don't ignore that. Absolutely, that's a fair concern, and it's fair to have those worries and disappointments, but name it and then park it, and then come back to what you can control and what you can influence, And they went, you're right. We've got all these kids that are at school that are doing amazing stuff. We should get on and influence them and support them in that space. And I love that simplicity. Although saying that, as humans, we're creatures of habit. And one of the habits they noticed is halfway through that conversation, they went, oh, flip. We've just gone back into things we're concerned about, and we're not what we can influence. And I think sometimes by having a mode or having a actual a framework, it allows us to speak to it. It's a bit like that thing around externalization. It allows us to speak to and go, oh, Toiho, I think we've gone back to the concern space again. We need to come back to what we can influence, and I think even as a group of staff, sometimes we spend a lot of time within our own teams of things we're validly concerned about, but don't have a control and don't have any influence over. And I think there's a real importance to go, notice what you can do and focus on what you can do and what are those things you can influence in those spaces. The last comment there, and this does not do it justice, but I'm going to allude to it really quickly, is the idea around some of Eric Berne's theory of transactional analysis. And if you've never done any thinking or work into this, I highly encourage you to look at it. But Berne basically talks about the fact that we have different modes or ego states, ways of operating. And he says in his thinking that we can operate as broadly parent, adult, child. He talks about being critical parent, nurturing parent. He talks about being a free child or rebellious child, or or more of a rational adult, rational, calm, collected state, and he says that if I'm in those states and you're in those states, there's things that go on, it's what he calls transactions. And he says these transactions, they have to operate in straight lines, and if I'm like the conversations you probably had in your breakout rooms, you've been in your calm, rational, unemotive state. You might have been passionate, but you haven't been flying off the handle or trying to rescue people. So you've been in the adult state, and hopefully the colleagues will come back to you in the adult state, and you get these lovely transactions going on. But he also says that sometimes you can be in this critical parent state, or someone's talking to you as a as the negative side of a critical parent, and often what can come back to you is a rebellious child, and Rich, you heard him talk before. One of a colleague of his had a crack at him the other day and came at him as a critical parent, and at the time he managed to keep himself in the adult state, but when him and I caught up afterwards, there was a bit of a rebellious child that came back, and recognizing that we come from different ways. Because Byrne then says really briefly that things happen, what they call cross transactions. And when a cross transaction happens, we've got to come back to an equilibrium state. We kind of come back to a straight line. And that whole idea that if I come across critical parent attacking you, it's very easy for me to do the reciprocal response. And sometimes we've got to see it for what it is. And as a leader, we've got to choose, how do I react? How do I respond, in those spaces, and that doesn't mean become a pushover. That doesn't mean become a walkover, but it does mean choosing when I'm going to respond and how I'm going to respond. And there's a statement down the very bottom that says, notice your reaction to things, because we're very fair to have a reaction, but like the swans, sometimes the reaction's got to be underwater, and then you choose your reaction, you choose your action. Choose the way you actually respond to something in those spaces. And I think to myself, they made me do it. In actual fact, that's false. And it's something my wife keeps challenging me with my kids. My 16-year-old didn't make me respond to it that way, well, her eye rolls did. No, they didn't. You chose to respond that way, and I think there's a challenge there that particularly when we're in turbulent times, particularly when the anchor's off, it's very easy to fall back into those places of reacting and saying, well, they made me. No, we are in control of ourselves. We need to take back that control of ourselves to go, what can I control? What can I influence? What states are at play here? And how do I be in the state that I need to be in to get the best results in what I'm doing in any given situation?